dear listener. As you lie in the comfort of your bed, let me take you to a world where shadows move, whispers call, and secrets lurk in the corners of forgotten places. These are not just stories, they are echoes of fears that sleep in the heart of darkness. Keep your eyes closed, your mind open, and prepare for the journey into chilling tales of shadows. The Anderson family thought they had found their dream home, a beautiful Victorian house nestled deep in the woods of Maine. It was the kind of house people write stories about, with its gabled roof, wide porch, and ivy creeping up the weathered walls. The price was too good to be true, but they couldn't resist. The first night was peaceful. The silence of the woods wrapped around the house like a blanket, and the family slept soundly, except for Sarah, their 10-year-old daughter. She woke up in the middle of the night, her room filled with whispers. The next morning she told her mother, "The walls talked to me, they told me their names." Her mother laughed it off as a bad dream, but Sarah insisted, her wide eyes filled with an unsettling seriousness. "They said they've been waiting." As the days passed, Sarah grew more withdrawn. She stopped talking to her parents and spent hours in her room, staring at the walls. One evening, as her father went to check on her, he heard faint laughter. Sarah's, but it sounded doubled, as though someone else was laughing with her. When he entered the room, she turned to him with a chilling smile. "They said they don't like you, Daddy." The family tried to leave that night, but the front door wouldn't open. The windows wouldn't budge. The house groaned, its wooden walls creaking as if alive. That was the last anyone saw of the Andersons. Weeks later, a realtor listed the house again. It stood quiet and inviting, waiting for its next visitors. Jake was a college student who prided himself on being practical, but practicality went out the window the night he missed the last bus home. The streets were deserted, the fog thick, and his phone battery dead. He wandered aimlessly until he stumbled upon a train station he had never seen before. Its wooden sign creaked in the wind. Station 13. The station was eerily silent. A single lantern flickered above the ticket counter where an old woman sat. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken. "Where does this train go?" Jake asked, uneasy. "Wherever you need to be," she replied, sliding him a ticket without asking for payment. A train pulled in moments later. It moved without a sound, its black carriages gleaming like polished onyx. Jake hesitated, but stepped aboard. The train's interior was dimly lit. The passengers sat motionless, their faces hidden in the shadows of wide-brimmed hats and hoods. Jake chose an empty seat and tried not to look at them. The train began to move, the sound of wheels on tracks eerily absent. Jake glanced around and froze. The passengers had turned to face him, their faces pale and decayed, eyes empty socket. "Welcome back," they whispered in unison. Jake screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness that consumed the train. He was never seen again, but on foggy nights, Station 13 still appears, waiting for those who need a ride, whether they want it or not. Lila had always loved dolls. Her room was a museum of porcelain faces, glass eyes, and intricate dresses. Her collection was her pride and joy. One day, while wandering through an antique store, she saw a doll that took her breath away. It was unlike any she had ever seen. Its face was so lifelike, its eyes seemed to glimmer with a hidden secret. The shopkeeper hesitated when she asked the price. "That one's not for sale," he muttered. But Lila was persistent. She offered triple the price, and the shopkeeper reluctantly agreed, warning her, "Never leave it alone at night." Lila laughed as she carried her new treasure home. That evening she placed the doll on a shelf in her bedroom. Its glassy eyes seemed to follow her every move. At midnight, Lila woke to a faint tapping sound. She looked towards the shelf, but the doll was gone. Panicking, she turned on the light. The doll sat on her bed, its tiny porcelain hand raised as if to knock. Lila screamed and threw the doll across the room, but when she looked again, it was back on the shelf, its dress pristine, its eyes gleaming. The next morning, Lila was gone. Her room was empty save for the doll sitting serenely on the bed. The doll eventually returned to the antique store, waiting for its next owner. Tom was driving cross-country when his car broke down near a small town. There was no signal on his phone and the road was empty. He decided to walk into the town, hoping to find help. The town was unnaturally quiet. The streets were empty, the houses dark. As he passed by, he noticed that every window had curtains drawn tight. All except one, a single house at the end of the street, had a light on. Desperate, Tom knocked on the door. When no one answered, he pushed it open and stepped inside. The house was eerily still. In the dining room, a family sat at the table, completely still, their faces frozen, in expressions of terror. A note on the table read, "Don't stay past dark." Before Tom could react, the door slammed shut. The room grew cold, and whispers filled the air. Shadows began to move, coalescing into humanoid shapes. The frozen family stood up, their hollow eyes staring at Tom. He ran, but no matter which door he opened, he ended up back in the dining room. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows closed in. By morning, Tom was gone. The house stood empty once more, its light inviting the next traveller. In an old estate sale, Annie found an ornate mirror. Its gilded frame was covered in intricate carvings, and its surface was flawless. Annie, an artist, thought it would be perfect for her studio. She hung it on the wall and began painting, the images she saw reflected in it. But the mirror was strange. It didn't always show Annie's reflection. Sometimes it showed people she didn't recognize, events she couldn't explain. One night, Annie noticed her reflection smiling when she wasn't. It leaned closer to the glass and whispered, "It's your turn." Before she could move, her reflection reached out of the mirror, grabbing her. Annie's screams echoed as she was pulled into the glass. Her reflection stepped out, stretching and smiling. The mirror now waits, its surface hiding Annie's terrified face, ready for its next victim. When Melissa checked into the quaint little inn in Vermont, she was enchanted by its rustic charm. Her room, number 9, was cozy, with a view of the forest and a soft bed that promised restful sleep. The innkeeper handed her the key with a nervous smile. "Enjoy your stay, but don't rearrange anything in the room. It doesn't like that." Melissa chuckled, assuming it was just small-town superstition, but curiosity got the better of her. As soon as the door closed, she began moving things around, a chair to the window, a lamp to the bedside table. At first, nothing happened. Then, around midnight, a loud creak woke her up. She found the chair back in its original place. The lamp, too, was where it had been when she arrived. She dismissed it as her imagination and went back to sleep. But the next morning she noticed something else. The mirror on the wall now reflected a room that wasn't hers, a dark, decaying version of it. And in the reflection, someone was standing behind her. Melissa turned, but no one was there. By evening, her room looked completely different, furniture she hadn't seen before, wallpaper peeling and a musty smell filling the air. She ran to the door, but it wouldn't open. As she pounded on it, the walls seemed to close in, and the room's dimensions began to change. The innkeeper found room 9 empty the next day, but Melissa's suitcase and belongings were still inside, untouched. Alex had just moved into a small apartment in the city. It was old and creaky, but it was all he could afford. The first night, as he unpacked, he noticed a shadow on the wall. It was odd because there was nothing to cast it, no furniture, no object, nothing. It was just a dark, human-like outline, standing perfectly still. Alex tried to ignore it, but the next night the shadow had moved. It was closer to his bed. He tried everything, covering the wall with blankets, turning on all the lights, but no matter what, the shadow stayed. One night he woke up to the feeling of something cold brushing his face. The shadow was no longer on the wall. It was standing at the foot of his bed, its dark form towering over him. Alex screamed and turned on the light, but the shadow didn't disappear. It leaned closer, and in a voice that sounded like the rustling of leaves, it whispered, "You took my place." The next day, Alex's apartment was listed for rent again. Every summer, children in the small town of Willow Creek were warned not to swim in Blackwater Lake. The elders said it was cursed. But teenagers being teenagers, Emma and her friends decided to take a midnight swim. The water was cold, darker than they expected. As they splashed and laughed, Emma felt something brush against her leg. She froze. "Did you feel that?" she asked. Her friends shrugged, but then one of them screamed. A pale hand had reached out of the water and grabbed his ankle, pulling him under. Emma dove after him, but the lake was murky and her friend was gone. When she surfaced, the lake was silent. Her friends were nowhere to be seen. Desperate, she swam to shore and ran back to town, but when she tried to tell the police, they looked at her with pity. "Blackwater Lake," one of them said. "It's been dry for 50 years. Emma returned to the spot, only to find cracked earth where the lake had been. But as she stood there, she could still hear the faint sound of splashing water. In a small thrift store, Nate found an old grandfather clock for a bargain price. It was beautifully carved with brass details and an antique charm he couldn't resist. The clock worked perfectly until midnight. Then it stopped, its pendulum frozen mid-swing. The next day, Nate noticed something strange. The clock had stopped again, exactly at midnight, and when he looked closer, he saw scratches on the wood, almost like claw marks that hadn't been there before. That night, as the clock struck 12, it began to chime. The sound was deep and haunting, echoing through the house. When the chiming stopped, Nate heard footsteps. They weren't his. He followed the sound to the clock, where the pendulum was now swinging furiously. Its glass face reflected something that wasn't in the room, a dark figure staring back at him. The next morning, the clock was gone. Nate swore he left it in the living room, but there was no trace of it. Somewhere, someone else found that same clock. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, there's a forest locals avoid. They call it the Forest of Whispers. Madison was an avid hiker, unafraid of old legends. She entered the forest despite the warnings drawn by its eerie beauty. At first it was peaceful, but then she started hearing voices, soft, indistinct whispers that seemed to come from the trees. "Hello?" she called out, but no one answered. The deeper she went, the louder the whispers became. Soon they weren't just whispers, they were calling her name. Madison tried to turn back, but the path had disappeared. The trees seemed to shift, closing in around her. She ran, her heart pounding, until she stumbled into a clearing. There in the center was a single tree with hundreds of names carved into its bark. As she reached out to touch it, she felt a cold hand grab her shoulder. Madison's screams were swallowed by the forest. Days later, her name appeared on the tree. Lucy had always loved carnivals. The music, the laughter, the bright lights. It was her escape from the monotony of daily life. One evening she came across a flyer for a travelling carnival called the Midnight Fair. It promised thrills, chills, and an unforgettable experience. Intrigued, Lucy decided to visit. Turn. The carnival was unlike anything she'd seen. It was eerily quiet. No music, no laughter. The rides creaked in the wind, and the workers, dressed in faded costumes, watched her with unsettling smiles. Lucy tried a few games, but quickly noticed something odd. She was the only guest. When she asked a worker about it, they simply said, "The others haven't arrived yet." As the night wore on, she felt increasingly uneasy. Then she saw it, a hall of mirrors, its entrance glowing faintly. Something compelled her to enter. Inside, the mirrors didn't reflect her image. Instead, they showed twisted versions of herself, crying, screaming, running. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the mirrors began to crack one by one. In the shards, Lucy saw people, faces filled with terror. They were trapped. She tried to leave, but the exit had vanished. Behind her, the mirrors whispered in unison, "Welcome to the carnival." Lucy was never seen again, but the midnight fair continued to travel, its flyer always appearing in the strangest places. Eleanor inherited a music box from her grandmother. It was a beautiful antique, adorned with intricate carvings of flowers and birds. When she wound it up, it played a hauntingly beautiful melody that echoed through her small apartment. At first, Eleanor loved it, but then strange things started happening. Every night at exactly 3 a.m, the music box would start playing on its own. One night, she decided to stay awake and watch. As the clock struck 3, the music box began to play. This time, she noticed something horrifying. The carvings were moving, the flowers wilted, and the birds turned into skeletal creatures. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, but growing louder, they sounded like her grandmother's voice, calling her name. Eleanor tried to throw the music box away, but it always reappeared on her bedside table. One night, as the melody played, she heard footsteps approaching her bedroom. The door creaked open, but no one was there. The next morning, Eleanor's apartment was empty, except for the music box, still playing its eerie tune. A group of friends went on a camping trip to a remote forest. On their last night, they decided to take a group photo by the campfire. When they looked at the photo, they noticed something strange. In the background, there was a figure, a woman in a long, tattered dress, standing just beyond the firelight. They laughed it off, assuming it was a trick of the light or one of them playing a prank. But as they scrolled through the other photos, the woman appeared in every one, always closer. That night, they heard rustling outside their tent. When they shone their flashlights, there was no one there. One by one, they began to vanish. The last friend left behind decided to delete the photo, hoping it would end the nightmare. But when he opened his phone, the photo had changed. Now, the ghostly woman was staring directly at him, her face twisted in a horrifying grin. By morning, the campsite was deserted. The phone was found weeks later with the photo still on it. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, the Johnson family moved into a charming old house. Everything seemed perfect except for one thing. The basement door was locked, and no one had the key. Curious, Mr. Johnson hired a locksmith to open it, but as soon as the door was unlocked, a foul stench filled the air. The basement was empty, save for a single chair in the center of the room. It was old and covered in scratches, as though someone had been clawing at it. That night, the Johnsons heard noises coming from the basement, whispers, footsteps, and sometimes faint crying. Their son, Timmy, became obsessed with the basement. He would sit by the door, talking to someone they couldn't see. One night, they found him standing in the basement, staring at the chair. "She says it's her turn to come out now," Timmy said, his voice hollow. The family tried to leave the house, but the doors wouldn't open. The basement door slammed shut on its own, and the whispers turned into screams. The next morning the house was empty. The chair in the basement had 2 new scratches. Henry was a travelling salesman who often stayed in cheap motels. One rainy night he found himself lost on a back road. Just as he began to despair, he spotted a brightly lit sign, the Haven Hotel. The lobby was warm and inviting, and the receptionist, a kind elderly man, handed him a key to room 7. Henry slept soundly, but when he woke up, the hotel was gone. He was lying in an open field, his suitcase next to him. Confused, he drove to the nearest town and asked about the Haven Hotel. The locals looked at him with pity. "That hotel burned down 50 years ago," one of them said. "Everyone inside. They didn't make it." Shaken, Henry checked his wallet. The room key was still there, along with a bill stamped with the hotel's name. Lila loved visiting antique shops, always on the hunt for unique treasures. One day she stumbled upon a painting of a young girl in a white dress holding a bouquet of lilies. The shop owner seemed eager to sell it. "Take it for half price," he said. "Just keep it covered at night." Intrigued, Lila brought the painting home and hung it in her living room. That night, as she was getting ready for bed, she noticed something strange. The girl in the painting seemed to be looking directly at her, though Lila swore her gaze had been fixed forward. The next morning, the painting had moved slightly, tilted on the wall. Dismissing it as gravity, she straightened it. But each night, the girl's eyes followed her. By the 3rd night, the bouquet in her hands had fewer lilies. Terrified, Lila covered the painting with a sheet, but it didn't help. She woke up to the sheet torn and the painting hanging at the foot of her bed. The girl's gaze was now filled with malice, her bouquet empty. The next day, Lila returned to the shop to demand answers, but it had vanished. The painting? It's still in her house. In the 1970s, Brian found an old radio at a flea market. It was a vintage beauty with large dials and a wooden frame. The seller warned him, "This radio picks up more than just stations." Brian laughed off the warning and brought it home. At first it only played static, but one night, as he turned the dial, a voice broke through. It was faint, a woman whispering, "Help me." He tried to respond, thinking it was a prank, but the voice didn't acknowledge him. Instead, it repeated the same phrase over and over. The next night, the voice changed. It was a man now, angry and shouting, "Get out!" Brian turned off the radio, but the voice continued, growing louder. In the days that followed, the voices began to haunt him. They whispered in his dreams, echoed in the corners of his house. Desperate, Brian smashed the radio, but even without it, he could still hear them. His neighbours found him weeks later sitting in a corner, covering his ears, screaming, "Turn it off!" Emma hated staying at her grandmother's house. The old Victorian home always felt cold, and the creaky wooden floors seemed to whisper beneath her feet. Her least favourite part, the closet in the guest bedroom, its door wouldn't stay closed, no matter how many times she shut it. One night, as she lay in bed, the closet door creaked open. Emma sat up, heart pounding. She told herself it was just the wind, but then she saw it, a pair of glowing eyes staring at her from the darkness. Too scared to move, she hid under the covers. When she peeked out, the door was closed again. The next morning she told her grandmother about it. The old woman's face went pale. "You didn't speak to it, did you?" Emma shook her head. "Good," her grandmother said. "It's looking for someone to invite it in." That night, Emma locked the closet door and placed a chair against it, but at midnight she woke up to the sound of breathing next to her bed. The closet door was wide open. In a small town there was an old wooden bridge that everyone avoided at night. Locals called it the Screaming Bridge. Legend had it that years ago a school bus lost control and plunged off the side, killing everyone aboard. One stormy night, Jack and his friends dared each other to cross the bridge. Armed with flashlights, they laughed nervously as they ventured onto the creaking planks. Halfway across, their laughter stopped. A child's voice echoed, calling, "Help us!" Their flashlights flickered and Jack saw shadowy figures at the edge of the bridge. Children, their faces pale and eyes empty. Panicking, they turned to run, but the bridge seemed endless. The figures followed, their voices growing louder, pleading and screaming. Jack tripped and looked back. One of the figures was reaching for him, its skeletal hand inches away. When he woke up, he was lying in a field, the bridge nowhere in sight. His friends were gone. To this day, Jack never speaks about what happened that night. Mia loved collecting dolls. Her favourite was an antique porcelain doll with curly black hair and a red dress. She named it Rose. One evening, as Mia was dusting her collection, she thought she heard someone whisper her name. She looked around but saw no one. That night she placed Rose on the shelf and went to bed. Around midnight the whispers returned, louder this time. When Mia turned on the light, Rose was sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at her. Terrified, Mia locked the doll in a box and placed it in the attic, but the whispers didn't stop. Days later, Mia found Rose back on the shelf, her dress torn and her face cracked. She tried burning the doll, but the flames wouldn't touch it. Desperate, she buried Rose deep in the woods. That night, the whispers returned. This time, they weren't just in her head. They were all around her. Mia's screams were heard by neighbours, but when they arrived, her house was empty. Rose, she's waiting for her next owner. It was a deal too good to be true, a 5-bedroom Victorian house on the edge of town, priced far below market value. When the Reynolds family moved in, they thought they'd hit the jackpot. At first, the house seemed perfect, but as they unpacked, strange things began happening. The basement door would swing open on its own, cold drafts swept through the hallways, and at night they'd hear faint knocking from inside the walls. One evening, their youngest daughter, Lily, came running from her room, crying. "The walls are breathing," she sobbed. They laughed it off as childish imagination until Lily disappeared the next night. They searched the entire house, but there was no sign of her. The police were called, but even their search yielded nothing. Then Mrs. Reynolds noticed something chilling, a new crack in the living room wall, shaped eerily like Lily's silhouette. Desperate, Mr. Reynolds tried tearing down the walls, but the more he tore, the more the house seemed to fight back. Rooms would shift, doors would vanish, and strange guttural groans echoed through the halls. One by one, the family disappeared, their silhouettes appearing in the cracks. The house, once empty, now seemed alive, waiting for its next occupants. Jake hated his new job as a night security guard at Green Hollow Cemetery. It was boring, cold, and more than a little creepy. On his first night, as he made his rounds, he noticed something strange, a fresh grave, unmarked and dug slightly off-centre. The next night the grave was filled, but there was no headstone. When Jake asked the groundskeeper about it, the man shrugged. "Must be a mistake," he muttered, avoiding Jake's eyes. By the third night, Jake started hearing whispers. They seemed to come from the unmarked grave. Against his better judgment, he approached it, his flashlight shaking in his hands. The whispers grew louder, forming words. "Help me! Let me out!" Terrified, Jake called the police, but when they dug up the grave, it was empty. That night, Jake quit, but as he left the cemetery, he glanced in his rearview mirror and saw a figure standing by the grave, a woman in a torn, dirty dress, staring directly at him. Even now, Jake avoids Green Hollow Cemetery, but he can't escape the whispers that follow him wherever he goes. When Sarah moved into her late grandmother's house, she knew the place would need work. The creaky floors, peeling wallpaper and dim lighting gave it a haunted vibe, but Sarah wasn't afraid. One day, while sorting through boxes in the attic, she found an old journal. It belonged to her grandmother and detailed strange occurrences in the house, objects moving on their own, strange voices, and an unseen presence in the attic. Sarah dismissed it as the ramblings of an old woman, but that night she heard footsteps above her bedroom. She ventured into the attic the next morning, but it was empty. The footsteps continued each night, growing louder. Then came the voices, low, guttural whispers that sounded like a language she couldn't understand. One night Sarah woke to find her bedroom door wide open. At the foot of her bed stood a figure, its face obscured by shadows. She screamed and the figure vanished, but when she checked the attic she found a single word scrawled in the dust: mine. Sarah moved out the next day, leaving the house to decay. Locals say the attic light still flickers at night, as though someone or something is still there. Every small town has its legends, and in Waverley, it was the midnight train. Locals claimed it passed through the abandoned tracks every year on October 31st. It was said to be a ghost train, carrying the souls of those who died tragically in train accidents. Ethan, a skeptic, decided to investigate. Armed with a camera and flashlight, he waited by the tracks on Halloween night. At exactly midnight, the ground began to rumble. A chilling whistle pierced the air and the train appeared out of the darkness. It was massive, its cars glowing faintly, and inside Ethan saw shadowy figures pressed against the windows. One figure, a woman in a torn dress, stared at him. Her mouth moved as though she was screaming, but no sound came out. The train stopped and the doors creaked open. A cold wind blew past Ethan and he felt an overwhelming urge to board. When he woke up, it was morning and he was lying beside the tracks. His camera was gone, replaced by a rusty pocket watch with the inscription, "See you next year." Claire had always hated mirrors. Something about their reflective surface unnerved her, as though they were windows into another world. One day she bought a beautiful antique mirror at an estate sale. Its ornate frame and pristine glass made it irresistible. The first night she thought she saw movement in the mirror. A shadow darted across its surface, but when she looked closer there was nothing there. Over the next few days the reflections began to change. At first it was small things, a chair out of place, a door open in the mirror but closed in her room. Then she saw it, a figure standing behind her. She spun around but no one was there. Desperate, Claire covered the mirror with a sheet, but it didn't help. At night she could hear whispers coming from beneath the fabric, calling her name. One morning the sheet was gone and the mirror showed an entirely different room. Inside Claire saw herself, but she wasn't alone. The figure was with her now, grinning. In the late 1800s, a small town was home to a reclusive doll maker named Tobias. He was known for creating lifelike dolls, so realistic that they seemed almost alive. When children began disappearing, whispers spread that Tobias was using dark magic to trap their souls inside his creations. The townsfolk stormed his workshop one night, finding dozens of dolls with hauntingly human eyes. Tobias was hanged, but before his death he cursed the town. Decades later, the doll maker's shop was turned into a museum. Visitors often reported strange occurrences, dolls blinking, shifting positions, or whispering faintly. One night, the museum's caretaker, Linda, stayed late. As she locked up, she heard a soft giggle. She turned to see the dolls had moved. They were all facing her now, their tiny hands reaching out. The next morning, the museum was empty, save for a new doll sitting on the shelf, one that looked exactly like Linda.